take this as an opportunity to give a bit of an introduction to like making theatre or any kind of performance-based art in a environmentally responsible way. And I think a good way to look at that is to look at like what is hard about doing that, what are the challenges, and what are the opportunities that are particularly present when we make something like theatre. As well as like end with just some food for thought about what you can individually do and some next steps and kind of places to go for resources and stuff like that. I think, feel free to take notes throughout. I know this is being recorded, but there might be just some stuff that, it kind of goes in easier if you write it down. I think we will get to some like specific actions. I generally am cautious of saying like you should do this, because I'm aware that every production is different in terms of like budget and resources, in terms of time available, in terms of like the abilities and sort of focuses of different team members. So for instance, if I say like, well, everyone should cycle to rehearsals, that doesn't work if everyone lives 50 miles away from the rehearsal room or can't do for mobility reasons or whatever. So there's always going to be a context in which any specific action doesn't work. So what I like to do is think about a framework in which to come up with specific actions that work for you and what you're doing and your team members, and that you can kind of take with you as you go. So yeah, I think basically there's going to be the next kind of like 45 minutes or so will just be like a bit of kind of back and forth. I'll be kind of throwing it open to you, and do feel free to jump in at any time. Just like raise your hand, or either literally or on the Zoom. But then at the end, I think there's a chance to ask some very more specific questions if they kind of come up. So I just wanted to kind of share a bit about my background. As Molly said, I'm a producer predominantly, also kind of a researcher and other bits and pieces. My background was originally in commercial production. So I worked in the West End for 5 years on sort of fairly large budget projects, and realized after a time that I wanted to pivot towards making work around like conversations I was having in my actual life, and that I was sort of expressing really passionate views about stuff and feeling really strongly about stuff, and wasn't taking that into the workplace with me. And I think some people can do that, and that's absolutely fine, and separate those two. But for me, I had the opportunity and the kind of impetus to kind of try and join those two things together a bit more. So that sort of led me to what I'm doing. I also consult for theatre companies and theatres about how to, and other kind of small businesses, about how to make their work more sustainable, or to embed some of this practice into what they do. And yeah, as Molly mentioned, I've researched into kind of climate change in British theatre, which is more of a text-based piece of research. But I think there's quite a lot of overlap, as you both sort of alluded to, about like if you're making work on particular themes, like there is some overlap there. I think like certain themes will naturally link to more sustainable practice, or sort of suggest that we go in that direction, but it's something that everyone can do. Obviously, I can only speak to my perspective, so everyone does this differently. There are loads of great practitioners, companies, people doing incredible work in sustainability and environmental responsibility in the arts in general. And I also wanted to just name the fact that like we should be centering the voices of Indigenous people, people of colour, people from the global south, and those who are marginalised and who experience the worst impacts often of climate and environmental crises. So there was a really nice practice at a conference I attended a few weeks ago, run by Julie's Bicycle, who, if you haven't come across them, are a really great organisation working at that intersection between kind of environment and the arts. And they, on every panel event, they had an empty chair, which just represented the voices not in the room, which is something I'm trying to like take with me, at least mentally, into the rooms I'm going into, and like what would other voices bring in to the conversation, and what are we missing by not having those voices. So yeah, why are we here? I feel like I don't really need to speak to kind of why we want to make sustainable work. Having said that, there are lots of reasons to, like, yes, the planet is in crisis, but there are also some practical reasons too. Like, it might help you get bits of funding to actually be able to make your work, for instance, if you know how to make your work sustainably. Audiences are increasingly becoming interested in that. So you are going to be connecting with those audiences who are interested in that. When I go up to Edinburgh now for the festival in the summer, the first thing I do is circle plays that are either about environmental themes or are produced in a sustainable way or doing something in that world. I know I'm not the only person, and I think over time there'll be more and more people who are looking for this. So yes, we should be doing it because it is the right thing to do, and I passionately believe that. But I also think there are other reasons to think about and just to be aware of, and sort of opportunities that come up through doing that. Terminology. Obviously, this is called sustainable theatre making, I think, which is like, there are different terms out there. The Arts Council now uses environmental responsibility rather than sustainability. In either case, what we're talking about is reducing harms. And we can recognize that these harms are quite broad. We're not just talking about like carbon. I think there's obviously a big focus on kind of the climate change element, but there's also biodiversity, there's also different types of pollution, and crucially, it's people as well as planet. So there are, all these issues have social impacts, human health impacts, and a lot of the things that created and caused the climate crisis are tied up in the legacies of colonialism and enslavement and forced movement of people and so on. So there's a lot there, and there is, I think imagery often does a bad job of telling us how much of a human story this is, as well as a planetary story. So yeah, and that's obviously why most people, a lot of people in the activism space use the climate justice model now to talk about this, in recognition that these harms are unequally felt and are unequally caused. So yeah, that all kind of escalates quite quickly, and I know it can feel very distant from like a small theatre production that you might be putting on or rehearsing or doing R&D or whatever. But I think it is really good to just like be mindful of the bigger picture, and then just sort of put it to one side in the knowledge that we can't like change the world overnight. But I think there's a lot theatre can do. So I just wanted to get people's thoughts on what like making theatre sustainably might mean to you. What comes to mind when you hear that? Or what have you, maybe it's things you've seen or other companies' work that you're aware of.
I think my problem is that I've hardly seen it, which is kind of interesting in itself. Sort of things that I've worked on myself, I don't think sustainability has ever really been at the core of it. And I think that's a real shame. So I think sort of I'm kind of interested to see what it could be like, kind of think is my idea. But I mean, sustainable theatre, as you said at the beginning, I get it must just depend on the situation, the people involved. So I think it must be very variable, but just, I guess, making better decisions where you can, and sort of more realistic decisions is sort of how I would see it as. But yeah, as I say, very limited knowledge of it.
For me, a lot of it's like awareness is a key word of like, what is that awareness of impact, and almost considering it as like a partnership. You're like, as a creator, you're always in partnership with the space. As a human being, you're in partnership with the environment, whether that's with a capital E or a lowercase e. So just finding what is that respectful partnership, as opposed to sort of a very manipulative relationship. Yeah, finding where you can support and uplift that partnership.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot there, isn't there? Because I think what you were talking to, Billy, was this idea of like, a lot of the time we focus on emissions, carbon footprinting, maybe we focus on like materials life cycle and things that feel very tangible and things we can put on spreadsheets. And there's this much more like maybe it's like too apt a word, but an organic thing underlying that. And yeah, it's relational. It's about how we treat the planet, how we treat the space we're in, how we treat the people we're with. And yeah, Nina, I think you're absolutely right. Like, it's just not centered enough in most like rehearsal rooms or production meetings any of us would be in. It's normally not the central tenet of people's work. I think that is changing. I mean, I started working in theatre about 10 years ago, and it was just like there were kind of a handful of companies who did it, but it was the same kind, you know, that there are like articles and books from the time about this will name the same like 3 or 4 companies. So it was just such a niche activity. And certainly in kind of conversations I would have on productions with like incredibly well-meaning people who, you know, in their personal lives might have been doing everything they could to reduce their impact, we're kind of thinking, well, we can't translate this to theatre, or we can't translate this to our work. And what really interests me is like, why can't we do that? And there are good reasons why not. So I think, you know, building on what you said, Nina, I think one of the big things is time. We're used to working pretty with time as a very limited resource, both in terms of like the length of a production period usually, and in terms of like the number of hours we have assigned to something. I'm just, something I think is really illustrative is that in the theatre industry, it's estimated that 70% of the workforce is freelance, which compares to about 16% of the general workforce in the UK. And when you think about the impact that has, I mean, it's huge. Not only does it mean that people are often juggling lots of different projects, but it also makes it much harder to implement changes strategically, right? Because if I'm working on 10 shows over the year, and I also have another job that pays the bills, and I also do a bit of teaching, and I also whatever, which is sort of a portfolio career that a lot of people in this industry have. You know, it's not like I just have to follow one company's sustainability policy. It's not like I'm going to the same office every day, which I guess lots of people aren't doing now, but where I know I can recycle here, and I know that, you know, the energy is from a green supplier or whatever. I'm in dozens of different rooms, I'm working from home, interacting with lots of different people, traveling around a lot. It's very difficult to then come in and be like, let's work strategically to be sustainable. It feels almost impossible to bridge that. Another big thing is cost. Like, most productions on any scale do not have the resourcing to work like optimally sustainably. You know, and that is true from like profit share fringe work right up to the big commercial stuff, because margins are always so tight, and even the biggest scale commercial work is losing money 80 to 90% of the time. So if you then shove in, you know, resourcing for finding props sustainably, costumes sustainably, paying everybody to spend the time doing the research, maybe traveling more slowly, all of that kind of stuff, it's really hard. I think there are a few other things that make it hard, like availability of sustainable resources. Like they just aren't, you know, people go to Primark to buy costumes because more sustainable options are more expensive to buy, but renting can also be more expensive, and there just isn't the availability in a lot of places, particularly regionally. There's often one costume store that you might go to within 50 miles to hire stuff, and they might not have the range you need. And then I also think there's that there's that slight sort of expertise gap. I think something I come across a lot is like, we all know really how to be sustainable, in the sense of, we all know that we shouldn't be throwing our set away at the end of the production. So we need to make it in such a way that it can be reused or recycled. We all know that like traveling by plane is worse than traveling by car, which is worse than traveling by bus, which is whatever. But we often don't have the details. So there's a slight knowledge gap there. I don't think it's the biggest problem, but we don't always know how to get around it. We don't know where to get that information. And it just seems like there are so many different bits of information we need, because productions are, even the smallest production is vast in terms of the work that goes on it. Every prop, every costume has a history, has a story. And if we were really serious about being as sustainable as we could, we would understand all those stories and all those histories, and we would try and change them and make them more sustainable. So it can feel really overwhelming. Yeah, I wondered if anyone had like any stories about like any, also wondering if Molly or Sophia, like if there's anything anyone's tried to do sustainably and realized like actually it's quite a bit harder than it should be.
I mean, I can just jump in and say spending time doing research and reflection, which will lead to better choices ultimately, is something that you struggle with if you have a lot of different commitments, essentially, and doing work that is fairly low paid overall. But just a very tangible thing is that I think when we did Vault's, the Fringe Futures Festival in 2020, 2021. 2020 was still COVID, like the big lockdown. We needed a set, and very, very small set. We just needed 2 stools, but easiest way to get that was IKEA. So that's, buying it just from IKEA without, like, because we didn't have the time or resources to think about where do we get them sustainably. They have been used since quite a lot, and they're easy to store and transport, but that's still a tangible, concrete example of when you don't have time to make a sustainable decision.
And there's also a thing about the time.
You be louder.
Sorry, thank you. There's also the thing about the time to think ahead, because we were much less experienced then, I think that's fair to say, and we sort of were a bit like, oh yeah, no, we need a set. But I think there is that element as well of the time, of that thing of like having a long lead in time where you have time to think and make those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like a lot of the collaborators were making the show were living in London and creating it in West Wales, which is the opposite end of the country. So trying to be like, okay, one, how am I going to financially afford this? With like how expensive trains are, and then also, what is that cost? Am I going to have to try and pack it all into 1 week instead of doing a longer process with people coming and going in order to sort of avoid that? I mean, luckily with starting out in theatre, me and my housemate were very good at talking to people about their skips. We were never too stressed on set, because we were like, oh, that's a nice chair, I'd like that chair, let me go and have a chat with them. Yeah, I think travel for me is one of the ones, because I love international collaboration, and it's like, okay, how do we manage that sort of the coexisting of what a global network we have, transcultural network in the world right now, but also a world that needs locality and sustainable practice.
Yeah, thank you for that. Two big takeaways for me for that are, one, there's often a compromise to working sustainably. So like, we know we can get to a lot of Europe by train, but it might take 2 days and it might cost a lot, and you might be pretty tired and uncomfortable afterwards if you've been on a train for a couple of days. So we kind of know how one would do that, but there are often like very good reasons not to do that because, excuse me, you don't have the money, or you don't want, your team to be traveling for 2 days, for instance. And another thing I think is just that this awareness of like the number of things we can't control. Like one of the biggest impacts that a production will have is its audience traveling to see it, and also consuming things that they'll consume there. So if it's a London show and you've got maybe 100 people seeing it a night, and they're traveling in, they're then maybe having dinner in town, which is, it's not your direct impact, but it is an impact that you are indirectly causing because hospitality is a high impact industry in terms of environmental impact. They are then, maybe going out for drinks, whatever. They're having a great impact on the economy, but they're not having a great impact on the environment because they've sort of come in to see your work. And so none of that you can really control. You can obviously like send out messages, but you can't directly control that. And that's true of so much other stuff. Like you can choose to buy stuff from more sustainable sources, but you can't actually control where it comes from. There are certain things you can only get from certain sources. If you want to advertise online, there are only so many places you can do that. And I'm thinking particularly about social media companies. You don't really have much sway when it comes to like their environmental policies, for instance. So there's a lot you can't do. There's a lot that's quite overwhelming, but luckily second half is going to be what you can do. So as I said, I think most of us know kind of what sustainable practice would look like in an ideal world. It would be like using less energy, less fuel, reusing stuff, working slower, all of that. But I think there are two phases to actually implementing some of this. The first one is identifying what you can do and what you want to do. And then the second is actually implementing it. So just to begin with identifying, I recommend an approach, and other people will recommend different approaches, but this is just kind of to get you thinking, which is like think with breadth, but proceed with focus. Because I think it is really important to begin from a point of what is everything we could do. And that is not just like every prop we could source sustainably, every piece of marketing we could deliver more sustainably. It's also thinking, in the process of making theatre, what are the types of impacts I have? And I think there are four. I use a framework that I summarize as like, how can I change? How can I learn? How can I influence? And how can I inspire? So we'll just go through those briefly. So change, how can I change? That's things that you're doing directly in your work that have an environmental impact. So that's kind of the stuff we've been alluding to a bit around like materials, fuel and energy. And most of it, to be honest, is carbon footprint and materials. And those actually overlap, because when we talk about materials, we're also talking about the carbon footprint of those materials. There is other stuff, like if your work involves, if you're working in outdoor theatre and your work involves disrupting a natural environment with high biodiversity and creating footfall where there normally isn't, that is an impact there. But for most people, that sort of impact will not be felt on the ground. It might be happening higher up the supply chain, from things that are grown that you're then buying, or things that are manufactured that you're then buying, but you won't be having it directly. So generally we're talking about these things. So that's how can I change. Second, how can I learn? Now, I think one really wastes an opportunity if you don't use every sort of effort to be sustainable as a learning opportunity. This might be about like something that you have awareness about, but through like an R&D or a rehearsal process, you get more data on. It might be about deciding to do specific research on a particular thing that you want to reduce your impact on. But ultimately, it's about ensuring that you and your team carry forward something from the project. There's no use making a production that's like optimally sustainable, carbon neutral, whatever it is, but then your next show is like, you know, that like a massive European stadium tour, you know, trucking tons of stuff by road. If you aren't able to kind of apply some of the learning to that. So I think it's really important to use everything as learning opportunity and actually create time for that, and think, okay, well, I'm spending today looking at how to do this sustainably. How can I actually allocate research time, either individually or as a team, to learn about this so that everyone takes something forward? Third one is, how can I influence? And this is a subtle one that I think a lot of people miss. So this is about things that you maybe can't change directly, but you can influence the behavior of others in the industry or in other kind of businesses. So for instance, this is like a terrible example, but if you want to print your marketing on recycled paper, you might start with local businesses. You might phone up the first place and they don't do recycled paper. So you can just have a really brief conversation, and it's not about being, it's not about preaching. It's not about being condescending. You know, every conversation has to have compassion because we recognize the pressures everyone's under, but it's about saying, okay, that's a shame. You know, please let me know if you do get recycled paper in, because I would love to use a local business, but you know, I've committed to doing this, and I know that other businesses are doing the same, and then maybe they will. It's about, if you're going into a theatre, yeah, you're not going to be able to get them to change their energy supplier, but you can have a conversation with them at the start and say, can I see your sustainability policy? You know, I've got a couple of questions. I'd love to come again next year. Like, I'm interested to know what you're working on. Just having those conversations is where I think we can have a massive impact that is often under-recognized. And the fourth one is, how can I inspire? And for me, that's about changing perspectives through the story that you're telling, not just your production itself, because that's a story, but also the stories you tell about that story. So your marketing, you know, your online presence, how are you telling the world about kind of sustainable messaging, about climate, about environment, about these kind of justice issues. So yeah, those are all probably quite overlapping, but for me it's quite a useful model. And sometimes what I do is get a piece of paper and just kind of divide it into 4, and I'm like, what can I do in each of these areas? And I think there are a couple of reasons it's useful. The first one is because I think we often get stuck on change with that first one. We often get stuck thinking all I can do is reduce my individual impact on this production. And we forget that there's this whole other world. Like, that's why we do theatre, right? Or why we create art, is to share something, to share a message. So, and probably also to learn. So if you're not doing that through the practice of sustainability, I think you're really missing an opportunity. But it also allows you to create, sort of maximize the impact of particular interventions you're having. So for instance, if you're making a show with recycled props, that's a change. But how can you then do research on that? How can you then share that research, which might influence others in the future? How can you then tell a story to your audiences about the importance of recycling? Again, recycling is maybe not the best example, but it's just about thinking kind of laterally about this impact. Yeah, I wondered if anyone had any thoughts coming out from that about maybe things that they've seen or have done themselves, and like ways you could expand that out a bit.
I went to this event once, it was like ages ago, where it was like the preview of a show, and they had like wine and drinks because it was sort of like a friends thing, so they had friends coming, but it was like you had to bring your own method of like drinking, which I have been meaning to say from the beginning. I am using a Starbucks cup, but it's only because I've lost my keep cup, and I feel awful about it ever since I started drinking, but I want that to be known that I do use one. This is an anomaly, a rarity for me. But anyway, I thought that was a really clever thing, and also quite like a fun thing to do. So like people ended up bringing quite weird and wacky things to drink out of. So if you're doing kind of like an R&D, I guess, say like, yes, we'll provide water, but maybe don't buy like bottled water, buy like a big thing, and then get people to bring keep cups or stuff like that. So yeah, I think finding like fun ways that make it a bit like quirky or stuff like that are often enjoyable and make it more of like a challenge in a sort of quest kind of way, rather than like a, oh my god, I've got to make sure I do this, which can be fun. So yeah, cool idea.
That's really cool. I love that idea. Yeah. Anyone else?
Going off the idea of fun ideas, yeah, finding something that's like integral into the work, so it's part of the work. So with rain pours, like coffee drops, which I'm bringing to Volts, it's always a different coffee roaster from a nearby coffee roaster, and usually looking into what is there. Are they direct trade? Is it a blend? How are they getting their coffee in? Also like the environmental impact of coffee, because I'm pretty sure there's no coffee being grown in West Wales or in London. Maybe there is somewhere. Yeah, just finding those like little things that are like help give it life, I suppose. Because actually it's, yes, a lot of the time it does come with more of a cost a lot of the time, but also it brings value in another way. So it's like, is it a cost if it's bringing value? It's yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I think like keeping it fun as well is so key, and part of that is a mindset thing, and is about like, yeah, just switching it from it being that it's this like sort of annoying add-on that we're trying to do, and we're trying to just like lower our impact a bit, to something that's actually you celebrate in the same way that, you know, presumably everyone working on a production kind of believes in the production itself. That's what you hope, right? And if you can get that same belief around your sustainability work, I think that's really important. Which kind of brings me on to my next thing, which is about kind of having thought broadly about what you can do. I think there are ways you can like be quite focused about it. So that's kind of picking what you're going to work on. I think it's really important to be realistic. We've kind of all mentioned it before about like it would be so easy to kind of set out at the beginning of a rehearsal process saying, we're going to do this, 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 and this. And it, you know, in reality, you're probably not going to do all of that. So focus on what you can achieve. Don't promise the world, and importantly, kind of like burn yourself out in the process, because we all want to be able to keep making this work and, you know, be happy while we're doing it. The other thing I'd say is that at a small scale, I think piloting, like doing one thing well and piloting a new approach on something, is in many respects much more valuable than kind of tinkering around the edges. I think a lot of people approach sustainability as this thing of like, well, we can. So yeah, a lot of people think of it as like, you know, how can I reduce my carbon footprint by 5%, 10%? How can I like recycle 10%? And like that is a valuable approach in some contexts. And if you're a big business, that is absolutely a very important thing to do, because your impact is huge. If you're a small production, and most productions, let's face it, are small in the grand scheme of things, we're not like oil producers or anything like that. You know, your impact is not massive. It's important to reduce it, but it's not huge. And so getting rid of 5%, 10% here and there is not really the best use of your time, I would argue. Something you can do is focus on doing one thing really well, learning from that, sharing that learning, telling your audiences about it, telling other theatre companies about it, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't. Maybe next time try and do it a bit differently, try and do it a bit better, or do something else. But kind of seeing this as a journey, I guess, rather than just like every production needs to be kind of perfect, or I need to reach perfection instantly, because we're just not going to get there. It's very difficult to make a zero impact. theatre production, partly because you would have to have nobody coming to see it, or coming on foot. So yeah, it's just not it's not a model that is going to work for everyone. And I think that, having said that, there are obviously theatre companies who are like proudly carbon neutral, and that is great, and that I really applaud that work, but it's not going to work for everyone. And so there are other approaches you can take. I think we've touched on it already, but kind of accept limitations to what you do and realize that if you make sustainable choices, you may have to make compromises elsewhere. But this is, this is something where I think you can be a bit strategic. So is everyone familiar with like a Venn diagram where you've got like a circle? Yeah. So I nearly made a slide for this, and then I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm not making a slide for this sort of imaginary Venn diagram that I'm kind of encouraging you to use. But one way of looking at it is you have it's a 4-circle Venn diagram, which actually you have to use ovals, because if you have 4, it's really difficult to make 4 intersections. But essentially the 4 are working more sustainably, working more affordably, i.e. to like a lower budget, making better quality work, which could look like any number of things, but it's whatever that means to you, and making your own life easier and the life of your team members easier. So more sustainable, more affordable, better quality work, life easier. Now, I think those are broadly like 4 things we all probably want to do. And there are other goals as well. There is like, we all want to make our work more accessible, and so on. I would put that under kind of both better quality work and life easier in some respects. So there are, I'm not saying that this is exhaustive and you can try it with different, what I try and do is like, in the middle of this Venn diagram, you're going to have stuff that you absolutely should be doing for all sorts of reasons, because it's making everyone's life better, it's making your work better, it's saving you money, and it's helping save the planet. So there's no reason not to be doing that work in the middle. So when you create this, you start to, there is not going to be much in there, but you might find 1 or 2 things that are right in the center of that Venn diagram. And you think, okay, this is really easy. There are going to be other things that are sort of like maybe intersecting 2 or 3 of these categories that you can think about how can you move them closer to the center. And that might be making compromises. So for instance, like if you do have like a cycle to rehearsals policy, that is more sustainable. It's more affordable if everyone has bikes, so that's a big if. It's probably not going to make your work better because everyone's going to arrive tired and sweaty. And it's certainly not going to make life easier, particularly for certain people for whom that's harder or even impossible. So how can you bring that closer to the center? And that might be saying, well, those who live close enough and feel able to, please, we encourage you to cycle in, and we will start rehearsals half an hour later to make that more feasible. I mean, you're not having to come in rush hour, and you know there'll be some free snacks waiting for you. Those who can't, we have researched the best public transport routes, and those who have to come by private car because of mobility reasons, or because they're bringing in, it might be a designer bringing in samples or a musician bringing in instruments. We're going to do a carpooling situation. And suddenly you have a setup where, again, this is a terrible example. All my examples will be terrible just because it's really difficult coming up with things for abstract productions. But as soon as you start to do that, you realize, oh, we can actually tick much more of these boxes, or rather be closer to the center of the Venn diagram, because I've mixed my metaphors. But then what also you're going to realize is there are going to be some things like right in the outer edges that are just only make your show more sustainable and actually make life harder, are incredibly costly, make your work worse. Everybody doesn't want to do them. And so what you can do by just identifying those is recognizing that either this is not what we should be focusing on right now, because there are so many reasons not to do it, that we can focus on the easy wins and making the middling wins slightly easier. Rehearsal spaces with showers, Yeah, that's a really great idea. I love that. Thanks, Molly. Yeah, there are sort of middling wins you can make a bit easier, and then these harder wins, you're just saying either we're not going to do this, or we'll do it next time, and we'll spend a bit of time researching how we might do it next time. Or you're saying, yeah, we want to do it, but we know we're going to have to really resource this and really focus on this. If this is important to us, we're going to need to put some serious time and energy into this. And so I mean, you don't have to use a Venn diagram. You can just, whatever works for you. But I think just kind of being realistic about what is and isn't achievable for all sorts of reasons is really valuable. So yeah, I wondered if anything came up for people from that, if anyone had any thoughts, if anyone had any stories other than the showers in the rehearsal rooms, which definitely going to be thinking about now. It's priority number one.
The other point is that a lot of councils have walking and cycling schemes that they're trying to encourage, and they're doing things like renting out. So this is councils in London, well, the London Borough of Waltham Forest. I know you can rent e-bikes and cargo bikes, I think cheaply or free, and you can try them out. So that's the kind of thing that maybe is a solution to the problem of transport for certain items. It wouldn't be perfect for everyone. And also e-bikes are a nicer way of traveling than a manual bike if you're going a long distance or you don't want to get sweaty or be tired. So it's that breaking that kind of binary between everyone's on pedal power or everyone's driving. And then I suppose the other point from that might be that, which is a thing I think you've made before, Ben, in some of our conversations, that you don't have to do this alone, and you're not the first person who's thinking about it, and that's something that's really valuable. And that there are people who've got expertise outside of the theatre industry who kind of have access to resources and want to support what a small business, which is what a theatre production is, as well as all the other things it is, be more sustainable.
It sounds really actionable. Like it's a really actionable thing that can go away and be like, okay, Venn diagram, boom. And also those questions earlier of like, how can I change? How can I learn? How can I influence? One of my questions was regarding, this it sort of popped up in the last 5 minutes, is regarding sharing learning. My thoughts were just like, okay, so what are the roots of actually sharing learning? Because my brain instantly goes, okay, I'll share a YouTube video. And then I was like, YouTube probably has some interesting, like, I don't know, what is their sustainability policy, and what is the impact of making a YouTube video, and like what are the I'm curious as to what ways there are to share information once you've sort of done that research.
So yeah, really good question. Carrier pigeon, I guess, or smoke signals, probably. No, not smoke signals, that's polluting. I would say, I mean, you can do research into like more sustainable web services. So there are hosts, like website hosts, that are more sustainable than others, just based on the energy they use and the efficiency of their servers and so on. Obviously, nothing in tech is impact free, and a lot of that is to do with raw materials as well as energy. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's a tricky one. I guess it's how you respond to it. For me, it's kind of about recognizing, yes, this is going to have an additional impact, but I hope that what I'm doing is in some way compensating for that. The impact is not going to be vast in the grand scheme of things. There are a lot of YouTube videos, TikToks, whatever, that are delivering much less value to the planet, often negative value. So if I can use that platform to create something that somebody might find valuable and can help, make their work more sustainable or better in other ways, more inclusive, whatever it is, that's something to consider. But I think it's a really valuable question. I mean, it just comes down to this thing of like, we cannot do everything. And there is another conversation maybe we could chat later if we have time, if anyone's interested in like offsets, because ultimately you reach a point with any effort to be sustainable where you realize there is no way I can eliminate this impact, so I would have to offset it somehow. And there are ways you can do that. There are some problems with them. Some of them are a lot better than others. But that is like a conversation you kind of, if you're reaching kind of a zero impact or carbon neutral goal, eventually you're going to have a conversation about offsets, because there are things you just can't avoid. Yeah, I just wanted to like, before we can chat more with questions and stuff. Oh, and thank you, Molly. You made a really valuable point about sharing kind of learning and information with companies and recognizing you're not on your own, which I think is really valuable. I think we're kind of in the early stages of formalizing those networks, but there are lots of them out there, one of which Molly has sort of co-founded with her sessions, monthly sessions, which I've attended a couple of them. They're really, really valuable. It's just great to sit and chat to people who want to do the same thing, but have different perspectives on it. It's really fun. So really recommend networking with other people trying to do the same thing. But I did want to end with like just sort of like a quick fire, like recommendations about how to implement some of this, and like things you can do. And some of them will be a bit more like sort of vague and zoomed out. Some of them will be a little more concrete. But yeah, so you can, maybe I'll just go through them then if you have questions. First one would be like, if you're a company or a collective or a partnership, even as an individual, perhaps, be to create an environmental policy / sustainability policy. It will change over time. You are not going to get it perfect on the first attempt, because there's no such thing as perfect. It is by definition kind of a work in progress. Maybe set a date each year to revise it, to review kind of how you've your progress, what else you feel that you can implement. But I think it's a good thing to do. On a production or in a company, a lot of people like to have a sustainability champion. So somebody who is just there, not just there, that sounds quite diminishing, but one of whose primary responsibilities it is to be the voice for sustainability in the room. I think there are pros and cons to that. I think it can silo sustainability, whereas as we've kind of discussed, it's so tied up in other questions around justice and kind of ethical working as well, that like, I think, yeah, I don't necessarily think that works for everyone, but at the very least, you might think about who is responsible for like collecting data, who is responsible for sort of facilitating moments where sustainability is being centered in the conversation. Which brings me on to creating space, and I mean kind of like mental and sort of metaphorical space. I think having dedicated meetings for sustainability, dedicated agenda items, maybe even in your own working practice, like time, like I kind of time block my time a bit during the day, having like an hour where it's like, okay, I'm going to spend this on making my practice more sustainable. I don't know what that's going to look like. Maybe it's going to start with just reading some stuff. Maybe it'll be a phone call I have with somebody who's also trying to do the same thing. Maybe I'll kind of write some ideas down. But again, there is a risk of kind of siloing that piece of your practice, but with time, you kind of create a habit where it spills over into other things. And then, yeah, the fourth big kind of vague point is around evaluating. Is like, we're often really good at setting goals, trying to implement them, and then it gets to like closing night and we just forget all about it. And evaluations are often really boring, but they are probably the most important thing when it comes to that learning, and also about what, how we can share that knowledge, what we could do better next time, all of that. And I would even say, because you might have shows that are quite far down the line in terms of production, and it might be hard to suddenly say, okay, well, we're going to try and do this more sustainably. It gets to a point where those sorts of decisions are really hard, but you can just say, well, I'm not going to be able to implement anything this time, but I'm going to do a really thorough evaluation and use this as a case study. And at the end of the process, look at it and say, what could I have done better? what could I have been more sustainable at? Yeah, I think just a couple more general points. There are ways you can understand your impact more concretely. As I say, it's normally going to be around materials and kind of carbon or emissions. It can be very hard and time consuming, but there are some great resources out there. Julie's bicycle is great for the kind of carbon footprinting, and the Theatre Green book is good for the kind of materials analysis. It just has some useful takeaways, and it also encourages a practice of materials inventories, where you just kind of record every material you're using for the production and where it's from, where it goes afterwards. And they have kind of particular goals for the levels of reuse, recycling, and so on. And I think it's a good practice to get into. It might not be what you choose to focus on, but yeah, there are resources out there for these particular things. Another great bit of advice is spending money on people and time rather than money on things. And the obvious thing is like kind of the example Sophia used earlier. If you're in a rush to source something, you're going to go to IKEA or Amazon or Argos, whatever it is. If you have half a day to source it, you might go to charity shops or look online for secondhand stuff or whatever it is. And just kind of having that faith when you're budgeting for a project and thinking, can I pay someone or give someone the time somehow to spend that, to do that work, rather than just, this is what I'm spending on props and costumes. A project I'm working on at the moment is planning to give every person an additional day purely to make their work more sustainable. So when we've budgeted it, we've said this is, and it would be lovely to have more than a day, but we've said, okay, you're in rehearsals for this month, blah, blah, blah. And then we're just paying you one extra day's fee. And out of that, we want you to think about working more sustainably. We want you to tell us how it's working for you, feedback, what do you need from us, all of that. If you have the budget for it, it's a nice thing to do. Penultimate thing, connect your goals, remind yourself why you're doing it. It's really easy to fall out of love with this kind of work, but just connect to it, remind yourself why it's important. And the final one is, I think, get outdoors. And I think a lot of people forget this. Like, we benefit so much in terms of health and mental well-being and so on, just being outside. And actually, often some of the best ideas about how to work sustainably and the best conversations happen when we're in an outside environment. And it doesn't have to be super wild. It can just be a city park. But there's something, I think, about that outdoor space that connects you to something. So yeah, that's my final bit of concrete advice, but would love to hear thoughts, questions, additional advice, things, whatever you want to share, basically.
No, that's been like incredibly useful. As I said sort of at the beginning, for me, it was just kind of about like opening my eyes to ways to do it and tips and tricks. So that's like really great, and it's already sort of got my mind kind of buzzing about new ways to do it. So yeah, just thank you so much. That was so useful.
Pleasure, thank you.
I've written down 6 questions, and I'm trying to think of. I'm probably going to answer them as I ask them, but I'll go through them one by one. So the first one, I think you kind of touched on a bit at the end, which was like, we spoke about early on the relationship aspect, but the hard tracking of like, this is the impact I had, which is very difficult to get the whole picture of, obviously. But in terms of resources, in terms of tracking your environmental impact, Julie's bicycle, Theatre Green book, was it? Is there any others you'd recommend?
Those are those are kind of the two two I would recommend for those two things. There are also, you'll find kind of individual toolkits. So like there's an Edinburgh Fringe sustainability toolkit, which just has bits of advice. There are lots of cool regional organizations as well. So it's always worth looking where you are for what is happening locally. But in terms of just that really kind of hard data, yeah, it's really hard. And to be honest, I do this for productions and for companies. And I always say, I cannot give you your full impact because there is no way you have collected enough data for me to do that. I will give you an impact as best I can show it, and I can compare it against other productions broadly and show where you could have done better. Thank you, Molly. Yeah, I can kind of like do a best estimate, but you're never going to get everything. And I think just admitting that it's fine. There are businesses who can. If you are a tech company, it is much easier to work out your impact. But yeah, I'd use those two. Julie's Bicycle for the sort of carbon footprint, and there are lots of carbon calculators online as well. And sometimes you just need to, use different ones for different things, whether it's travel or materials or whatever it is.
Okay, grand. Yeah, thank you very much for sending those through as well, Molly. I feel like that's answered one of my questions later. One of this is more of like a deep question, but like I'm interested in terms of like and I guess this comes more to societal change and arts council change, in that do you think there could be a possibility of, at the moment there's you can apply for money and then get access costs in order to make work more accessible without it feeding into that money for the grant, access costs come on top. Do you think there's a possibility of there also being something like that for sustainability? Because I feel like one of the issues is people are like, I'd love to, but that's going to eat into so much of my budget for the rest of the project. So if it's in the values of, I mean, Arts Council Wales, one of their main values is like sustainable practice, but there's no budget to support that really.
That's a really good point. I guess to kind of sit from the other side, kind of the access money is to sort of level the playing field in terms of not inflating the budget of particular teams or people who would have those needs. Whereas I guess sustainability is kind of on all of us in some respects. So I can see why that's not happening, but I think it'd be great. I mean, I don't know about Wales, but Arts Council England have got environmental responsibility section on the application for project grants and for NPOs now, which wasn't there a couple of years ago. Yeah, how's it in Wales?
Yeah, I think there's something somewhere. I think the general, like, how are you helping the world section. Okay, grand. Thank you for sharing that. And the last question, I've omitted a couple of them because was about per diems. So I think the minimum is like £25 a day or something like that. My thought is, if you're giving someone £25 to go and get food, and this will happen, like I find whenever I'm like, if I'm traveling to London to do a show, I'm going to have a takeaway, or I'm going to eat out or something. And it's like, but then I'm giving £25 to a stage manager who might be doing that as well, as opposed to like, I don't know. I guess what I've written is, I haven't even written as a question, I've just written per diems, but like the impact coming out of your hands as a leader. So like, I don't want to say you can only go and eat from these restaurants, or I have to make you food and you can't wait and you've got to enjoy my cooking. Like, what is that thing of how much responsibility you give? I don't know. Maybe that's said some words.
I guess kind of in that is like per diems maybe encourage like sort of like reckless consumption in a way that if it was your own money, you might not take some, have so many takeaways or eat out as much. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I guess it's like the money for the per diems is coming out of the company's money,
Yeah.
So if that money's going towards takeaways, getting like loads of disposable things, like meal deals are a classic. I think like recently I was just buying hundreds, like £100 worth of meal deals for a company as a producer, and I was like, oh my god, this is environmentally, this is really nasty. And it's like, how do you manage that?
Yeah, I think it's something we often overlook, because these are often quite last minute decisions, right, about kind of eating. And I've often been on like set for something, and it gets to like 2 p.m. and no one's eaten, so you do like a £200 delivery or something, and it just all comes in all this plastic. But I think there are a number of ways you can do it. One is to just make it easier for people to make better decisions. And that's the same thing that businesses do, governments do, so on, in theory, around sustainability, right? Is, can I give you a list of more low impact eating options that are near your digs? Like, I've done the research. Here are the places that don't use plastic. Here are the places that are more plant-based, whatever it is. I do feel a bit weird about giving people eating recommendations, because I think there's like a lot of cultural stuff tied up in that. And I know like most people wouldn't want to anyway. But I think about making it easier for people. And also having, and this is something I probably should have mentioned earlier, but like involving everyone in this conversation. So when you have your first meeting as a team, you're saying that we're trying to do this sustainably. We welcome your suggestions. We'll make some suggestions. We don't want to make this painful. We're trying to do this in a way that also, is an ethical way to work, feels fair. But we might make suggestions about how you can lower your impact. And please don't take that as criticism or as condescension. But we just want to encourage certain behaviors, however it feels right. But I think having that conversation early on and checking in with people is a great thing to do. But yeah, obviously, I know you're also not going to kind of be punishing people for their decisions.
Yeah, cheers. It's a tricky one, but yeah, I think there's plenty there to work with. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fine for now.
I mean, I think it is the food question's a really interesting thing, because sometimes it can be, you don't want to be going, I'm sorry, was that a meal deal that you've got in your hands? But there's also something can be really generous about offering food. And especially, I know people have talked about doing that on a low budget, show, where one of the things is you do bring in food and have that as an offer, but also accepting some people may choose to not do that. But I think there's something about choosing to be really generous and giving something as an offer rather than it being compulsory. And here's some snacks you might be interested in, and letting people know about the options seems like a really good thing. But yeah, it's a challenge but there's, I suppose, also, sorry, I have a lot of thoughts about this. Turns out there's also the thing about time, and just if your lunch breaks are 20 minutes versus an hour, you might, when you've got an hour, go to somewhere there's a bit more time. And if your fee's really low, you might go for something that is not, is less sustainable than if you've got more time. So I think, and then the third point on food is, what are your rehearsal spaces like? Is there, if people are commuting from home, is there a place where they can heat up soup and eat and stuff like that? And when we were rehearsing in more COVID-y times, you know what I mean, that was often a challenge. And it's a small thing, but it does have an impact when you can't have a cup of tea or heat up something in the microwave because of rules or because that isn't available, and then that suddenly shortens your options as well.
Agreed. Yeah, those like days when rehearsal rooms didn't even have kettles during sort of year 2 of COVID or whatever it was pretty bleak. But yeah, I'm gonna just put my email and Twitter in the chat, which feel free to reach out. Yeah, just about anything really. Like, I realized I just really enjoy kind of sharing sustainability problems with people, and I would, for Nina, obviously you're in London, Billy, if and when you're in London, the meetups that Molly and Sophia run are really great. So I really recommend those as well for sharing ideas with people.